In the Torah portion of Terumah, chapter 25, verse 3, we read that the tabernacle was constructed of gold, silver, and copper. In other words, these donations were required for the construction of the tabernacle. Now, why were these three metals required? There's a profound spiritual message here. And that is about the intrinsic divinity of humanity. If you are truly one with your essence and the divine spark within you, then you will sense it in others. Other human beings, no matter who they may be. Whatever their past may be, whatever their actions may be, however they may look, you will sense that there is a spark of God in all mankind. And that, to drive home that message, the tabernacle had to include gold, silver, and copper. Gold representing superheroes. Silver representing solid, decent people. And copper, in Hebrew, nechoshes, is very similar to the word nachash, which means serpent, the primordial serpent. Copper represents the unredeemed, the people who have messed up their life and haven't sorted it out yet. The tabernacle includes all of those, because the divine essence, the divine spark, is in every human being. And if you're sensitive to your own spark, you will see it in others. Now I'm going to ask you a philosophical question. Could God make a square circle? Yes, you heard correctly. The question is, could God make a square circle? Now, I know you're thinking this is a ridiculous question, but this is something which perplexed philosophers over the ages. In other words, could God do a logical absurdity? The precise question they asked actually is, could God make a triangle whose hypotenuse was shorter than one of its other sides? And the Jewish medieval philosophers such as Maimonides said vehemently, no, God can't make a square circle. And now you're going to tell me, well, God can do everything. There's nothing he can't do. He's omnipotent. But that doesn't mean he can make a square circle, because there's no such thing as a square circle. It's an absurdity. We're not in any way weakening the power of God by saying he can't do something which isn't real, which is just absolute nonsense. That was the view of the philosophers. But the Kabbalists said, yes, God can make a square circle. You can't understand what is a square circle. It sounds like absolute nonsense. But just because you can't understand it doesn't mean that God can't do it. And the Jewish medieval philosopher, the Rashba, also maintained this position, and he described God as Nimna Hanimnoes, which means that even the impossible is possible by him. Now, how do we know all that? So the Rashba cited an example from this week's Torah portion, that the ark measured 2.5 by 1.5 cubits of space, and yet when you put it in the Holy of Holies, it took up no space. In other words, if you measured from one end of the Holy of Holies to the other, and took that dimension, and then you measured from the side of the Holy of Holies to the side of the Ark, and then from the other side of the Ark to the other side of the Holy of Holies, it was the same distance. It took up no space. And this was, of course, some sort of miracle. But it's a logical absurdity. How can something take up space, and at the same time take up no space? That, says the Rashba, is a proof that God really can do anything, even a logical absurdity. Chapter 25, verse 32, the menorah should be hammered, and Rashi informs us from the sages that it had to be hammered from a single piece of gold. You couldn't take separate lumps, carve the arms of the menorah separately and then weld them together. That was not permitted. It had to be made out of a single chunk of gold. But what's the message here? So, Kabbalistically, Rabbi Menachem Rekanati, Italian Kabbalist, teaches us that the 7 arms of the menorah represent the 7 emotional attributes of God, the 7 sifirot, which convey God's emotions to the world, which is chesed, kindness, gevura, severity, tiferes, beauty, netzach, victory, hod, splendor, yesod, connecting, and malchus, humility. Now, one of the dangers of studying the Kabbalah, which is why for many centuries it was an esoteric science and the public were not exposed to it, which thankfully has been a trend which has been reversed in our generation. But one of the dangers of it, and the danger still exists, is that when you learn that God has these attributes, you might mistakenly think that there is multiplicity in the divine Godhead. And this, of course, is against the basic tenet of monotheism, that there is one God. We need to understand how these are only emanations of God, they are just godliness, and yet at the same time they are submerged and one with his essence, and they are genuine expressions of God. That's a hard feat for the imagination. But, to teach us this message, the menorah, the 7 attributes, had to be made of one chunk of metal. Because this is to drive home the point that even though there are 7 different attributes of God, they are all in essence one, and they are not a contradiction to his absolute oneness. Chapter 26, verse 1, we read about the curtains, the tapestries, which overlaid the tabernacle. They formed the roof of the tabernacle. They were laid over the planks. What is the significance of these tapestries? So I'm going to read you a portion of the Zohar now about the tapestries. When God created the world, he covered himself with primordial light, and with it he created the heavens. Light and darkness were not together, because light is from the right side and darkness is from the left side. What did God do? He joined them together and created the heavens from them. What are the heavens? Shamayim in Hebrew is the word for heaven, which is a conjugate of the 2 words, Aish and Mayim, fire and water. He joined them together and made peace between them. And when they were joined together, he expanded them and spread them like a curtain. And this is the meaning of the verse. You should make the tabernacle from 10 tapestries, from 10 curtains. Fascinating insight there. Now, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Lubavitch Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak of Lubavitch, actually explained this in terms of the colors of these tapestries. You see, the tapestries contain crimson wool, which is red crimson wool, which represents Gevurah, the left side, and they also contain turquoise wool, which is blue, representing Chesed, or the right side, and they also contain purple, which is the harmony of blue and red, the Tiferes. So really, this idea, what the Zohar says, that there's Eish and Mayim, there's the right and the left, harmonizing in the tapestry, in the Shamayim, that is alluded to actually very beautifully by the colors in the tapestries themselves. Chapter 26, verse 19, we read about the sockets of the tabernacle, which were made of silver, and into that wooden planks were inserted. Now, isn't this a bit odd? Wouldn't you expect the foundations of the building to be made of wood or some junk, and the actual structure itself to be made something of beautiful like silver? Why was this building made of wood, and the sockets, the foundations, of a precious metal? So there's a very profound message here. The sockets were connection pieces. They connected the tabernacle together. And what the Torah is trying to teach us is that sometimes the connection is more important than the structure. And that's really a very important message in our lives. The spiritual already exists, the physical already exists. Our job in life is to connect the two, to harmonize the two. People are already in this world. They have character traits. Our job is to bring harmony to the people that are already in the world. Success is already there. It's a blessing from God. Our job is really to make the vessel, the connection between that spiritual blessing of success and the actual success in this world. So really, the idea that the connection pieces of the tabernacle were made from precious metal was to drive home that connecting different elements in this universe is really a very precious task indeed. Spiritual message for the week. We read at length about the tabernacle, but of course this is history. The future temple will be a permanent structure in Jerusalem made out of stone, and not this temporary structure that was built in the desert. So why, if the most important structure is a permanent one, do we read about the temporary one in the Torah? Because the tabernacle did have one advantage that the Holy Temple did not. And that is, it was movable. It enabled Judaism to move to the far and distant, around the desert, to the most places bereft of inhabitation and spirituality and civilization. And there's a very important message there. That at the very heart and core of Judaism is the idea that we should be spreading the light of the Torah to different places, even to a spiritual desert. It's not supposed to stay in one place. Judaism is not supposed to be in the synagogue. It's not supposed to be in the home. It's not just supposed to be in the books. Of course, it's supposed to be all of those places, but not just there. It's supposed to move out like the tabernacle into the desert and bring holiness there. Thank you so much for joining us next week. Please again, Torah in 10.